You are listening to In Pursuit of Development with Dan Bannock.
Every now and then, a single institution becomes so central to the global development landscape that it shapes entire debates about poverty reduction, about humanitarian response, about democracy and stability, and about how the world's most powerful actors choose to engage beyond their borders. And for decades, the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, has been one such institution. It has been the world's largest bilateral donor, a key instrument of American soft power, and a place where ideas, politics, and evidence-based policy have intersected, sometimes productively, sometimes tensely, and always with real consequences for millions of lives around the world. But in the past year, USAID has been thrust into the spotlight for reasons very different from those that development scholars, practitioners, and partners around the world had grown accustomed to. What happens to development, to global cooperation, to crisis response, to long-term investments in health, education, and governance when the world's biggest aid agency is suddenly restructured or diminished? What happens when the internal architecture of an institution designed to generate and use rigorous evidence is dismantled? And what do these shifts tell us about the politics of aid, the fragility of development institutions, and the broader uncertainty we are all navigating in international affairs today? These are big and difficult questions, but they're also very timely because we are living through a moment in which development cooperation and foreign aid is being questioned, reshaped, and in some cases openly challenged. But the needs haven't gone away. If anything, they've grown. Fragmented geopolitics, climate stress, rising conflict, shrinking fiscal space, and the reordering of global alliances all place immense pressure on low-income countries. Which makes it even more important to understand what USAID was trying to do in recent years and why, and what its sudden transformation means for the way evidence, cost-effectiveness, and institutional learning are valued in a sector that is often pulled in many directions at once. To help unpack this, I'm joined by someone who has had a unique vantage point, someone who stepped directly into the machinery of U.S. development policy, tried to modernize it, and saw both the possibilities and limitations from the inside. My guest this week is Dean Karlan, the Frederick Esser Nemers Distinguished Professor of Economics and Finance at Northwestern University and former Chief Economist of USAID, a role Dean held from 2022 to 2025. He is widely known for his pioneering academic work on impact evaluations, behavioral development economics, and the rigorous use of evidence to inform policy. But at USAID, he was tasked with something unusually ambitious, building from scratch a new office of the chief economist, creating a team, and embedding cost-effectiveness and scientific thinking across a sprawling institution that operates in more than 100 countries. It was a moment of optimism inside the agency. There was momentum, there was political space for reform, and there was hope that USAID would become more analytically driven, more systematic in how it used evidence to shape programming, procurement, and strategy. And then, quite suddenly, the landscape shifted. In today's conversation, Dean and I discuss what that journey looked like from the inside, the vision for the office he built, the process of navigating congressional holes and bureaucratic hurdles, the challenges of changing organizational culture, and the broader implications of the recent dismantling of key elements of USAID's architecture. This is Dan Bannock, and you're listening to In Pursuit of Development. Dean, lovely to see you. The last time we met in DC at this really nice restaurant, things looked very different in the world than they do today. So welcome to the show. I wish it was under different circumstances, but nonetheless, welcome.
They did. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to see you again, talk to you again. Unfortunately, not over a really good spinach dish.
So, if you recall our dinner, we were talking about effectiveness, aid. You'd recently been appointed the chief economist of USAID, a position that apparently did not exist before you. Everything was new, and there was a lot of optimism then. This is what, January 2023, I believe. There was optimism in the sense that you had accepted this position, if I recall, because you were asked to come and help USAID make the organization even more effective. And you had all these hopes and plans. You had hired all these people, and fast track to today, it doesn't exist anymore. But walk us through what happened earlier this year.
Sure. So one clarification that is a little bit important for my in terms of what we were doing and what shifted within the organization. And just clarification of your introduction. I was not actually the first chief economist of USAID. And the difference is I learned in bureaucratic speak, actually quite important. What I was the first head of an office of the chief economist. And that might sound really, really wonky and whatnot and bureaucratic, but it actually signals a really important change that was part of the thinking of from the leadership, which was let's prioritize cost effectiveness evidence and using and science in general, social science in general, to inform USAID globally and across many, many sectors and issues. And let's really empower this prioritization of evidence to guide what we're doing. And in the past, and there were, some great people were chief economists before me, but their mandate and their charge was not that. It was much more focused on providing advice when asked about economic growth and very specific issues that are kind of much narrower in scope, and it was within a bureau that limited their ability to address issues across the sector, across sectors, and did not equip them with a staff to do things, right? They were kind of on their own to like do this. There's just only so much you can do, and in fact, the single biggest process change that we did, and the biggest when I look back and reflect on my short period there, the team we built was exhilarating, and we just brought, I mean, some amazing people, both within USAID who came into the office, as well as amazing people from outside who shared that vision and came in and joined to try to help make the changes we were making. And by the time we started off with one employee before me, who's basically kind of the person who helped make it so that the office was getting created, and I joined. And then, by the time we left, we were in the low 30s in terms of our headcount. And obviously, headcount is not the objective, but it's a signal of the enthusiasm with which we were greeted, both internally as well as externally, to try to build this evidence focus within USA.
And I'm told that wasn't easy because you had to get money you had to be creative, right? To get money, because most of this money comes from Congress, and this was a new office, this new setup. So you had to lobby. Was it philanthropies? Where did you get the money?
Yeah, so we don't lobby, just to be clear, like
Okay.
as government employees, that's not the word we would ever use or what we would do. But I did learn that, it wasn't like we created the office and all of a sudden, Congress had preemptively appropriated money to fund our office, right? And so yes, we were, faced with immediate challenges of where are we going to get the money from in order to do this? And we can try to be scrappy within the agency, but most of the money within USAID was spoken for on sector and country, and the allocation processes happened like well in advance of us showing up. And so we were, it was flattering and also a fair amount of work to go and speak to several philanthropists who saw the leverage story. Basically, they were like, okay, I get it. With one employee, you can then help guide how many millions of dollars. And we did a bit of a portfolio analysis after a couple of years to say what has been the return on our office in terms of the change in the way funds were getting allocated from, if $100 million moved from a program which created, X good to 1.5X or 2X good, then that's a 50 million or $100 million gain divided by the total cost of our office, not just the wins, but the total cost. And when you think about that portfolio return, we ended up at around a 50-to-1 return on investment. So we were quite proud of that. And obviously that's some speculative numbers have to go into that kind of calculation, but we tried to be conservative and hold ourselves accountable to that kind of calculation. And when you're able to have those kinds of returns, that's the kind of returns you get from doing systems change work, as often it's called. Then it makes a very strong case to particularly the crowds that are very attuned to the quantification of the impact of philanthropy.
So what happened in those 2 years? I mean, I'm just thinking about the time when we met, January 2023 and then January 2025. You got these 30, 34 people together. This office was established. What was the first set of issues you had to tackle? Was it the short-term impact evaluations? Was it to get enthusiasm for RCTs? What was it what were the first wins you achieved?
So the first win we achieved was actually creating the office. That alone took about 6 months. There was a hold from Congress, and USAID has, aims to respect those holds, and there's a complicated history in that. But the fact is, Congress does have the ability to put holds on reorganizations, and this was considered a reorg. And so that was the first obstacle, was on trying to understand, well, why is there a hold? What is it who is it that's holding, and what is it that they want? And what was striking to me, and again, I'm just learning about government and how it works, was when we finally understood what it is that they wanted what we wanted. We wanted what they wanted. It was the same thing. And they actually knew a lot about the committee members who were kind of behind the hold were actually intellectually are some of our strongest allies for wanting exactly what we wanted. And you just have these layers of in between, kind of preventing sometimes those kinds of candid conversations, which can help make you realize that no, actually, this is not about a Republican Congress versus Democrats running USAID. This was actually both sides wanting exactly the same thing. So it took time to get through that and have that understood. The second thing I would just say is the basic idea of using the evidence that's out there and a lot of that evidence, because USAID is doing a lot of things that are about program services. It's a lot of doing something that has direct interaction through an intermediary, through a contractor, an NGO or a firm, to provide a good or a service to households, firms, communities. Those are the kinds of things that the academic world has made huge inroads in the past 30 years. If someone came in to try to do what we were doing, even 10 years, maybe 20, definitely 20 years ago, they really could not have done what we were doing, because there just wasn't, the movement to be doing those kinds of careful evaluations using randomized trials in development was really just took off in the late 1990s. 2000s is when it really started, increasing. But there wasn't enough evidence. You don't want to change policy in Zambia because somebody in the Philippines did a study on it and found a certain thing, and so let's just all of a sudden change policy in Zambia. But now we've had about 5,000 randomized trials, and so in development, and so now we can really start making more inroads and speaking better to how to contextualize, when does something work, when does it not. That basically combined with a lot of staff within USAID aware of that existence, but not really able and well suited and with the time and bandwidth and sometimes technical skills to actually use it and put it in place. But we were greeted by a lot of people who were eager to see us, and we just kind of opened shop and immediately had the willing and eager contingent within USAID, which was quite large, knocking on our door saying, love it, love the fact that you're doing what you're doing. How can I help? How can you help me? And we were busy from day one because of that, in providing that kind of direct hands-on support to the pen holders in different missions. And so our work overall, best described as taking two prongs in terms of process. One is, and I'll skip the first part, which was just us or me learning a lot about how does USAID actually work, how does procurement work, et cetera. And so there was definitely a learning curve for at least me, and a lot of people there who generously helped me learn. but our work is best described in two prongs past that. One is the hands-on consulting almost. We were almost like a consulting unit within USAID working where there was demand for the kind of evidence-based work that I'm describing. And the second is more institutional changes, things that were about the actual procurement process. Things like getting the term cost effectiveness actually defined and in the kind of rule book of USAID, right? As a term, that was actually really useful to just have a working definition that everybody that you could use, you could point to, and have everybody use and have it used in procurement that then has everybody speaking the same language. That's huge because there's a lot of misunderstandings sometimes about that phrase.
From an academic perspective, I would be very fearful, even apprehensive of joining NORAD or trying to figure out the daily routines of procurement or being told not to say certain things or not to speak out of turn and the hierarchy. And, as an academic, we're not used to this. And so you had to, as I
Yeah.
understand, get, used to this new situation. But tell my listeners, Dean, what was it that struck you when you started commuting to DC as you did on a regular basis?
Yeah.
Because I've lived in DC, Foggy Bottom, hung out in some of those streets, the World Bank and the International Food Policy Research Institute and USAID, all these international organizations. There is this perception that there are thousands of contractors, whether it's defense or it's aid, or everybody's lobbying for something, everybody wants something from you, and it is difficult to get a grip, isn't it, about the architecture. And then, of course, you have Congress, you have the executive, the White House, the State Department. There's so many actors all involved and have a stake in this pie. So did that take you 6 months, and did you get a good? I mean, were you prepared? I suppose somebody mentored you or gave you the short story. How was it like then? I mean, what was
Um,
your impression of the aid architecture in Washington?
yeah, they're interesting question. Let me throw out two broad thoughts. The first is minor, which is you couldn't be more right about there's a very big difference between the seminar style of an economic seminar and government meetings. And I had a team that was, let's say, although they didn't have to be tactful with me, and I think they learned that, was very good at basically schooling me and telling me, "Hey, Dean, tone it down." You know, it's not an economic seminar. Like, so, that's I don't know if that's what that says about economists, about me, but regardless, that is in a sense, the consensus nature that's underlying that is, for what it's worth, actually one of the challenges that I think we faced, is that that consensus nature is not just about tone, but it also in meetings and message, but it also manifests itself in when there's a problem that everybody is trying to solve and everybody has differences of opinions on how to best solve it. There's often a tendency to try to come up with a consensus, which often means can everybody have a little piece of the pie and seeing things done the way they want them. So how does that manifest itself? If you have a procurement where you're going to dole out $100 million on some effort over 5 years, and you have 10 people sitting around the table with 10 different ideas on what to do, all to the common goal, all to like trying to address food insecurity in northern Kenya, fine. And so they might have 10 different ideas on how to do that. And one of the things that was our message in our office was each of those ideas may be great relative to doing nothing at all, but they all can't be better than each other. So how do we help that process become aware of what are the trade-offs they're facing across? And you can't always end the meeting singing Kumbaya, we all get a piece of what we want. That you need to look at the evidence and make those trade-offs clear and help people be aware of what they are. So that was one fairly quick thought. The other thing to point out is, and it goes a little bit to what you're saying about what I faced in terms of my own trade-offs and what I needed to learn. When I was first asked to do this, there were three parts to the ask in terms of the job description and the charge of the office. The first was on evidence use, and this is on like how do we shift the way we're spending money towards the most effective use we know of or to innovation where we're carefully measuring, one of the two, where we're carefully measuring and doing impact evaluations. But focusing on just the first, on just where we actually have strong evidence about the most cost-effective way to do something, how do we align the USAID process to be funding that? At USAID at 40 billion a year, I didn't have to do much math to figure out like if my goal was to help improve the way we are fighting poverty issues, like I'm not under no grand delusion that the impact of any one of my research papers is that high. So when I thought about the trade-off between slowing down my research for a few years and doing that, I didn't have to like do much math. That I felt quite strongly that working to help improve the evidence use was far and away the most productive use of my time and effort. And if I didn't do it, frankly, I would have been a hypocrite. And I would have had to change my kind of life story when people say in contexts like this on a podcast, tell me how you got into doing what you're doing. My life story is that I got into it because I was working in development and I was seeing that there was things being done without evidence, and and yet the kinds of things were being done seems like they were actually being debated. Are they good or are they bad? Not just like how good, and gosh, why are we making these decisions without evidence? And that's what inspired me to be a researcher in the first place. So it would be pretty hypocritical of me to then, when given the opportunity to help improve the way the largest bilateral in the world is using evidence, to say, yeah, no thanks. So that for me was the calculation. And I knew that there was a lot that I was going to need to learn about how government works, how USAID works. My short answer to your last question is yes, there's different constituents, but and they have different views on different matters. There's one commonality of just about everybody I met within USAID, which is they were there because they cared about other people and they cared about the United States' role as a leader of the world in helping other people, and our kind of, whether they cared about that because of the soft power benefits to America playing that role, whether they about our as being a moral leader, or whether they cared about it just for its end result impact on other people, in a sense, all the same for the way they, that's all a strive to be better about what we were doing. And so there was a certain commonality, even if you have different opinions on how to do that I think permeated a lot of conversations. So that helps because, it's not to say that people don't care about their budget and their this. And so there's, constituents to pay attention to. And obviously not everybody that feeds off of the system is doing it out of altruism. But one of the things we did to tackle some of what you're saying is a shift from cost benefits to cost effectiveness, which might sound very wonky and econ jargony, but so let me just say what that really implies and why that's an answer to your question. When you do a cost benefit, you're able to compare all things to each other, all things. You can compare health to education to economic growth. If you can haggle about how you're doing the cost benefit calculation, what you're including in benefits, long run, all these, other kinds of effects. It can be complicated, but at the end of the day, you're getting a return on investment. You're putting dollars in the numerator, dollars in the denominator, and you're getting an ROI, a return on investment, percent return, right? So to do that, you have to convert lives to dollars. You have to convert climate change to dollars. You have to convert domestic violence to dollars. You have to convert all these things to dollars. That's obviously riddled with a lot of challenges and philosophical values and good, honest debates that are, I don't pretend to have an answer to how you value those things. We can talk about different methods. But here's the thing, doing that isn't actually that useful, at least within the USAID system because the decisions about how much to spend on different sectors is actually made by Congress. And the decision on how to spend in different countries is mostly made by Congress. And so if we're talking to the constituent, to go back to your question and the kind of political economy of it, that cares about health, and we're proposing to do a cost benefit analysis for them, that actually is, in a sense, potentially using that analysis to inform the decision as to whether health should get more or less money relative to other sectors. That doesn't always make us the most welcome group at the table. If instead we said, no, 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 no. Whatever your goal is, we respect it. And we're here to just help you. And whatever your budget is, it is what it is. We're here to help you get the most bang for your buck. That's what cost effectiveness does. It takes the outcome as is, whether the outcome is life saved, whether the outcome is, it could be income to farmers, but it also could be climate mitigation. It could be domestic violence. It could be child malnutrition. It could be whatever you want. And then the question is, what are the different options for how to move the needle on that outcome measure and which is most cost effective? And so that makes us everybody's best friend because we're just there to help them reach their goal. We're not there to judge their goal and judge whether it is a good goal relative to other goals, et cetera.
But isn't that a problem, Dean? I mean, aren't you also willing sometimes to say, look, we should not be prioritizing that. We need to be more flexible. It should not always be up to Congress. It should be something that, you decide on the move. We should be much more flexible. And I'm thinking about your initial conversations, those 6 months in Congress. I mean, I don't know if had to be confirmed or whatever, the hearings, but you said something interesting in the sense that you said that it was like this bipartisan I suppose, agreement on some of the overarching intentions, right, of USAID, that the politicians weren't oblivious to some of the major reasons as to why US was providing all of this money. Was it 0.6 or 7% of the GDP? But when you were interacting with Congress, did you get a sense of where the disagreements were? I mean, if it is agreement on cost effectiveness, what were the disagreements about? What were they actually wanting more of or disagreed among themselves, the Republicans and Democrats?
So first, let me answer the first part, which is the two-part question. One is, should we weigh in on health versus education, things like this? I mean, what I can say is that that's a much more political process. It isn't something, whether USAID should or should not have that power is like a separate matter. Right now, obviously, what we're seeing is that the executive branch is taking that power and Congress is stepping back and letting them do it. Even though they do, in theory, have that power of the purse, but it's only a power of the purse if you actually stand up and use it. And so we are seeing that happen. When I was there at USAID, there was no one proposed doing things of that nature. So it was never the basic question was never actually even brought to me in that way. The closest way that it was brought to me was something that we were pushing for, which was if you can, for instance, do things that strengthen the Ministry of Finance, that help them do better scenario planning for currency movements and cash flows, that help them collect more tax revenue, domestic resource mobilization work, then that if you can spend $1 that helps them collect $5 of good taxes, let's call it,
and thereby be less dependent on aid,
and then they can spend that money on health, right? You can actually help health by helping the Ministry of Finance, right? And so it's indirect. And so we were there to try to help identify cases like that might be less than obvious. But it wasn't that we would be called in to do that to change the focus from health to something else, but just to point out the interconnectedness of different areas and help do that math basically to see those linkages. But I was never part of a meeting in which it was being discussed, should we ignore Congress on this large allocation of money and just spend it elsewhere?
I would just think if you're, in the operations business, you would know that, look, this is what is the need of the hour, and it's too long and cumbersome to go back to Congress. We should have that mandate to take decisions, on the spur of the moment, because that is the need of the hour.
Well,
I mean, that's what I would have thought.
I mean,
Yeah.
look, there is a budget for humanitarian affairs that allows them to pounce on crisis and act quickly. And there's been long support for humanitarian work. In fact, that's one of the areas that many identify as having bipartisan support, perhaps for different reasons, but still does have some bipartisan support. And, frankly, my hunch is that not enough attention is actually paid to the long run over the short run in those cases. The long run lacks a bit of salience, but there is strong evidence that certain things you do that are at the humanitarian nexus development space that are dealing with refugees who have already been in the camp for a couple of years or more. How do you help assimilate and integrate households into local economy and help them so that they're not needing, humanitarian support for the next 20 years? So that kind of work is could be actually really critical, but doesn't have the same emotional heartstring as the immediate crisis. And so you see less attention from that. That's an area that we were working with the Bureau of Humanitarian Affairs to roll out programs of that nature. In fact, those were some of our biggest wins, was rolling out those kinds of programs with the BHA, BHA being the acronym for the Humanitarian Affairs Group.
And the second part of my question was about the disagreements in Congress.
So it wasn't, so first of all, there was a lot of different conversations with Congress that took place that were well beyond what I was doing. Things with Latin American affairs, obviously, were very wrapped up into people coming to the border and questions there. There was obviously questions on access to reproductive health issues around the world. These were not issues that I dealt with directly, but obviously were front and center to a lot of the conversation and debates. The conversation which I was most involved in was when there was congressional questions about the evidence side, about what is the evidence of the short run, the long run. Why what is the quality of this evidence that we're producing? And there, I think it's a very common issue that's not just unique to Congress. There's a lot of misunderstanding of the difference between following people over time who are part of a program versus having an actual impact evaluation where you can say, how did those lives change compared to how they would have changed without the program? And for that, there was, just like everywhere, I think that even though there's a fair amount of sophistication by some in Congress, there's a lot of misunderstanding and false attribution there, where it's like, no, we want, why aren't more people tracked for the long run? And, the fundamental problem with that is even if aid works, you can see people's lives get worse if there's bad economic conditions, bad political environment, bad weather conditions, people's lives can get worse. Likewise, people's lives can get better as growth happens, as good things happen in the world. Poverty does go down in the long run over time. And so you'd have a lot of false attribution, both up and down. And the main thing we were bringing to the table was to not look at evidence like that, but instead to look at evidence that carries with it some way of measuring what would have happened without the program. And that's basically the heart of what a randomized trial offers. But you can't go around doing randomized trials on everything. And so when Congress would ask for that kind of evidence, or evidence of what's the long run, what's the impact in the long run, there was often a bit of a disconnect between what they wanted and what they were literally asking for in terms of measurements, because they were asking for the tracking of outcomes, not the
Or willing to fund, right? I mean,
they're willing to fund. There was this one earmark for what's called ex post impact evaluation, or ex post evaluation, which was unclear in its writing whether it included what we would call an impact evaluation that does track that counterfactual versus just tracking people over time. But even that, it was a very small earmark relative to USAID. It was, in 10 to 20 million kind of zone.
Did people often ask you, Dean, tell us what works? We have been asking this question to USAID and we haven't heard it, we haven't got a good answer. Give us a list of things that work and, what we should focus more energy and money on.
I think that it didn't usually come over in that way. At least the conversations I had were not asked in that way. They would ask more. I'll never forget one question, which was in some sense exactly the right question, but it was the first time I had a meeting with people in Congress. So I wasn't, kind of very formal and a bit in the way it was set up. And obviously I was nervous about what to say and what not to say. The question came over, hey, why doesn't USAID ever show us negative results?
Yeah.
And, what went through my head is the obvious, which is, well, first of all, USA doesn't do that many impact evaluations, and I'm not actually sure they should be. They should be using the evidence of what works and what doesn't, and then tracking, did you execute what you said you would execute? Did you execute it well? Right? But it's not obvious that they should be spending money on impact evaluations for something that is already well established with its impact. Take a think about, if you're gonna distribute immunizations. You don't need to do impact evaluations on the immunization itself. If it's already well established in the medical literature that this is an effective medicine and immunization, then they don't just roll it out and get people to get that medicine or immunization. But you don't need to run an impact evaluation to see the impact on infant mortality. And that same thing applies to other areas, even in the social science side of the world. The other thing which went through my head, which I didn't feel comfortable saying, was, well, gosh, can you commit not to then using that evidence of is something not working against USAID in a moment of defunding it? And so, right, so a good, honest set of evaluations should show some wins and losses and should show that you learn from your losses and you modify and you edit your plans and you're going forward and you adapt and you learn, right? That's the optimal process. If you showed me an organization which only produced great, amazing impact evaluations, I would I would be highly skeptical of the evidence quality and the honesty and independence of it. And I would also, let's say it passed all that, then my next question would be like, oh my gosh, this I think means that you're not taking on any risks, any innovation. It reminds me of some of my earlier work as a researcher a lot of my earlier work was with microcredit. And whenever I was with a micro lender that would brag about 100% repayment rates, I would cry foul. And like, that's a sign of failure, not success. That means your role as a bank is to take on risks and diversify, because you can diversify that risk away and kind of know what it is on average. But you want to be able to empower the individuals to take on loans that may or may not work out with investments. And if you're getting 100% of your money back, then you're probably not making loans to people that would actually very much benefit from getting loans in order to improve their lives, take on some enterprise risk, but yet grow.
Yeah, I mean, some of these discussions, some of these questions are also being asked here in Europe, Dean, in terms of politicians saying, why is it that we don't hear about things that do not work? We also need to hear more about what works, but let's get a balanced picture. And this comes from a lot of the NGOs who are, in my view, I may be wrong, rather reluctant, I feel, to talk about the bad stuff or the stuff that they weren't able to achieve despite stated and very lofty goals, because they fear a cut in allocations to their organizations. So that fear that, talking about negative stuff will lead to funding cuts also prevents, I suppose, that is my argument. It actually reduces the legitimacy of what they're doing because it should be balanced. It's not like everything is rosy.
Right.
But I'm asking you all of these questions because I'm sure there are lots and lots of people, Dean, trying to really better understand what's going on in the United States, what's going on in Congress. How on earth could you dismantle something that was so fundamentally important to soft power? I've had Joe Nye on the show, the inventor of the term soft power. And there's so much more that our countries can do through a policy of attraction rather than coercion, rather than using brute force, attracting others because of our culture, because of what we do. And one of the biggest sources of soft power for the US has been foreign aid. And you've now, in many ways, I don't mean you, but the US has really taken a step in the wrong direction. And a lot of us can't seem to figure out what was Congress thinking? What was the White House thinking? And the sheer fact, Dean, every day there are these calculations, either from the Center for Global Development or other agencies, talking about millions and millions of lives around the world that are affected. People are going to die or are dying because of the recent dismantling. It wasn't necessarily a shock, I would imagine. I mean, you guys in USAID knew what was perhaps coming, but perhaps not to the same extent. So what was the scene like after the elections in November? I mean, what were you, and you were anticipating something, but not to the same extent, I would imagine.
That's right. Most people most people expected, everybody got out Project 2025 who wasn't already familiar with it, read through it, and saw that as what to expect. And then, so that, what does that mean? It means certain sectors were going to go away. No work on, no gender, no LGBTQ work, no climate,
Democracy promotion or something like that.
democracy promotion. Oddly enough, I think that one is I always found to be an odd space since it is so much aligned with conservative thinking as well. So yeah, the expectation was some of these sectors. Climate is a good example of one where, unfortunately, there were a lot of tagging of things that weren't really climate, but just called climate. You're working with farmers to help them better off in the face of shocks. One of those shocks have to be climate, and then you call this climate. If the task of canceling things and not doing things is as simple as looking for things that were promoted as being pro-climate, then those things were actually vulnerable when they really shouldn't be, because all they were doing was plain vanilla. Let's help farmers be more resilient. So we're expecting some of that to go away. We're expecting a budget cut overall. For the things I was there to do, frankly, the idea of being more effective with what you got is something that resonates on both sides of the aisle. That, and there was definitely a way of thinking that people had of saying, well, when times are tough, it's even that much more important to be cost effective. As a side note, I've always found that to be a kind of a bizarre argument. I'm willing to use it and be a bit Machiavellian if I think it's going to be useful for getting people to think harder about the evidence of what works and what doesn't in a cost-effective way. But the reality is, when budgets are flush, it's also more important to be as effective as we can with the resources we got. I've never been in a situation where resources were so flush that it really just didn't matter at the end of the day. We were going to solve it one way or another. So that's never been a problem I faced. So, but regardless, I was willing to use that. There are a lot of things where helping markets develop and helping people get access to markets is a great strategy for helping to address not just the short run, but the long run problem in a country. That kind of thinking about the role of markets for development is something that a lot of Republicans are supportive of. So there was a lot of things that I cared about and I saw as the right strategy, which were very aligned with both sides of the aisle and with some of the very people that were rumored to be coming in under a new administration. Those people never came in, though. The people that were of that mindset of saying, hey, let's look at evidence and let's choose things that are most effective. And so there were some people that I was really hoping would come that I knew that would be great allies for what we wanted to see happen, but they never got tapped. My understanding is that there wasn't a plan. There was the plan to destroy USAID was not there wasn't a plan so it wasn't. You're describing the destruction of the soft power as if there was someone actively saying they think that's wrong and they have a different philosophy. And I don't think that's the way. Everything I'm hearing suggests that no one sat there with an alternative theory of the world saying, no, this is the role for it. Instead, it was more of a Doge-driven effort to find an agency that they could throw in the wood chipper, to use their exact words, and a demonstration of power and, in a sense, completeness of just destroying something. And that's a really tragic way to think about the role of government and the way government should work and the way government should decide what to do. And it's a bizarre use of the term efficiency. I mean, after all, what DOGE stands for, at no point was efficiency ever. Actually, here was the single thing that I thought was most striking was the DOGE's bean counter, which itself was deemed fallacious over and over and over again for declaring cost savings across the board, never once took into account the benefits. So if they dropped something that was spending $100 million on something, they would call that drop $100 million of savings. So they would ignore the fact that those $100 million maybe were generating $200 million worth of economic benefits to people in America, or 50 million, either one. The point is, you don't get $100 million savings. You kill that 100 million. If it was creating $200 million of good, then you've just made the world or the US government $100 million less efficient. If it created $50 million of good, then maybe that was a good thing to kill, but you don't get 100 million on your scorecard, you only get 50. Like, the fact that they ignore that is just really telling about their lack of analytical rigor or honesty to how they were even thinking about what it means to be efficient.
You may well be right that there wasn't an active plan to dismantle USAID, but It's shocking that there was no appreciation of the consequences to lives around the world, but also to US power and influence. So now you have one of the biggest actors in aid, in global aid, has virtually disappeared. We have a huge shortfall, tons of conferences, everybody talking about financing for development. Somebody needs to step up. Is it the EU, the Nordic states? We are generous, but we are small actors. Is it the philanthropies? In the US, I remember initially, the initial months after the dismantling of USAID, there was talk about, China, the fear that China is going to take over when the US has stopped, in terms of providing aid. So who should step in? How do you see this aid world being reconfigured? Do you think there will be greater emphasis on South-South cooperation, Europe-centric aid, or maybe the age of aid is over? Maybe, we should be talking about something else. How do you see this field progressing? I know you're still actively involved in providing advice to aid agencies.
I think this does highlight, I have two basic thoughts. One goes back to something we talked about earlier. And the second is that it does highlight the need to not be ever so dependent on any one donor. I don't know if there's, maybe there's other donors that can just be more relied upon that just don't have that vulnerability that we have in the U.S. with political swings. But if it's a bilateral aid agency, then odds are there's some democratic process to choosing their leaders, and swings can happen. So that's a lesson for low-income country governments, basically, and that's going to potentially, it seems to me, increase the cost of trying to help, because you have to, for a country to even accept aid now going forward, they need to figure out how to do it in a way that allows them to not be so dependent on it, to maybe saving some of them. Different things you can think about, but they inevitably end up being more costly to do business that way. The other thought for you is just that I wouldn't say the word "should" is a powerful word, and what I would say for that is should others act more, right? Well, I think that I would have said yes 2 years ago too, or a year ago, that there's a lot of good that can be done in the world, a lot of good that is in individual countries' national interest, even if that national interest is merely one of being a stronger nation as a byproduct of standing up and helping others. That is part of what makes us strong as individuals, is being able to see past our nose and be a leader in our global community and helping others and contributing to global goods, global public goods, as well as just helping those less fortunate. And that's a sign of and path to strength. And I would have said that a year ago. Right? Just because you just look at the wealth, and whether it's held by individuals or by sovereign powers, compared to the good you can do, the disconnect is massive. Now it's a little bit like the question, what we were expecting within USAID, a smaller budget, more emphasis on cost effectiveness, to which my answer was, well, sure, of course, I'm happy to say that. But I also think when times are flush, you should also be as effective as you can be. That's the way I think about the should, is we should have before, because there's great things we can do on the margin and make bigger impacts with our dollars. Yes, it's all the more important now to do it because of kind of diminishing marginal returns, in terms of aid. So obviously we're kind of further down. It means the dollars that we spend now, or the euros or the kroners we spend now, will be that much more effective. But I don't think it's fundamentally changed the should question, right? We should be doing it now just as we should have been doing it before.
Dean, lovely to see you again. Thanks very much for this lovely conversation and for coming on my show.
No, other way around. Thank you very much for having me. It was great to talk with you.
Thank you for listening to In Pursuit of Development with Professor Dan Bannock from the University of Oslo. Please email your questions, comments and suggestions to inpursuitofdevelopment@gmail.com.